It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
Hey, welcome back to the Real Estate Breakfast, your go-to property podcast right around Australia. Yeah, we cover Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Canberra, all of those key cities. We try to be in your local as much as possible. I probably need to sort of clone myself a little more so that we can do it more often. Hang on, wait a minute. I can do that with AI, can't I? It is a Thursday, August the 21st, as we go to Sydney and catch up with Margaret Lomas from Destiny Financial Solutions. Now, tell us a little bit about this next endeavour, because you've been doing quite a bit of travelling in 2025 and you're off tomorrow somewhere.
Yes, I am. I'm doing an expedition cruise, and I hesitate to use the term cruise when I tell people about it because to me, cruise has connotations of giant ships with thousands of people and bad shows and probably worse food. And that's certainly not my thing. That's never been my thing to do that. And I do cruise a lot. So while I'm not a cruiser, I cruise a lot, but I select a cruise line that has very small ships. And in this case, it's an expedition ship. What it does, it's around about 200 people. Every day it goes to somewhere on this particular cruise, fairly remote. I'll be on board for 34 days and we'll be visiting the Kimberleys, Papua New Guinea, remote islands of Indonesia, a lot of remote places. And every day you hop off, you get into zodiacs, you zip out into the jungles, into the crocodile-infested waters, you hike. You do a lot of that kind of activity-based things, all part of the cruise. And thankfully at night, you just get to go to the bar and have a drink and go and have a nice meal in a restaurant, and you don't have to subject yourself to a vaudeville show with, people who can't get a real job and therefore they go and work on a cruise ship as an entertainer. So it's going to be fabulous fun. We've really been looking forward to this one. Nice to get away, but really nice to do all that exploring. That's right up my alley for a holiday.
And you've really sort of been exploring, haven't you? I think you probably hit your late 50s and you're in your 60s now. And it really is that time. If you can afford to do it, you've got an appetite for it. Why not? I was telling you off air, when I was younger, everybody was doing their OE. I wasn't, because I was engaged in a business, just couldn't do it. But then the other side of the coin for me, it didn't really appeal, sort of backpacking. When I was in my 30s, I was able to go anywhere and stay in a hotel. Much better for me.
Oh, 100%. And there's a couple of factors for me. I mean, firstly, I had 5 children. I had 3 with my first husband, my first marriage, and I worked all through the having those children and running my own small business at the time. Met my current husband, who I've kept for a long time now, 33 years we've been married, and he, took on us all, and we had 2 more children together. We had our own business really from the very early days together and worked very hard at that business, very long hours, went without an awful lot of things. We were working definitely 100-hour weeks, both of us, for a long time, and many, many times going really without much in the way of income because, you're getting a business established. It does take you a while. And we always said that we knew that us traveling and doing all of those things would come in the future. And for both my husband and I, we're not material kind of people. We live in a really nice house, but we're not into things. We like to eat out, but we like experiences, and travel is definitely our thing. I just think that all that hard work that we did and all that time that we sacrificed when the kids were growing up and the hard work of raising a family, it's now paying off for us. And we don't know how much longer we're going to be this fit and active. We're both very fit and active. I'm particularly fit and active for my age, but who knows what's around the corner. I don't want to be one of those people who waits until I'm much older and then finds that I'm not capable of doing the things I love to do and leaves all my money to my children.
Yes, well, I'm going to take you all the way back now. You talk about working extremely hard and sometimes in difficult situations. Let's go all the way back to the 80s, because I thought it'd be interesting to look back maybe across 40 years at the real estate comparisons for real estate interest rates, also major cities and the bigger regional ones, etc. Look at deposits and wages. So let's start there. What have you dug up out of the 1980s?
This was a great exercise even for me to do because I've lived through all of these decades and I've experienced all of this. So it was a little bit like a trip down memory lane for me more than a fascinating secret that I was uncovering. I certainly remember most of these things. I want to talk first about the cash rate because when we go back through the decades, the cash rate always interests people because it is indicative of interest rates. But there's an interesting link between the cash rate and the mortgage rates that I think I wasn't aware at the time, and I'll explain that in a minute. But starting back in the 1980s, during the 80s, the cash rate went from 10% at the beginning of the 80s to 17.5% by 1989. That was the cash rate. We understand that cash rates and mortgage rates are a little bit different and there's a buffer built in for the bank to make a profit. But it's interesting to think that that's how high it got during that time. Now, if we go to the next decade, the 90s began at 17%, but at some point in time dropped as low as 5%. That was the cash rate. So it completely turned around during the 1990s. And there was definitely an equivalent period of time in the 90s where we didn't see a lot of property price growth at first because of that 17%. And then toward the end of the 90s, we started to go through a bit of a property boom. In the 2000s, we entered the 2000s at around about 4%, and we peaked as high as 9.5%. That was in 2008, but ended that particular decade at about 7.25%. The 2010s, we entered 2010s at 4.75 and ended that decade at 0.75. So very low, but the early 2010s, we did peak out at 7%. And in the 2020s, we started at 0.10 and ended that decade at where we're at now, which is a cash rate of around about 4 odd percent. We did peak up at 6.5% at one point in time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, particularly the 2000s. I think a lot of people will go, gee, I didn't realise that it did get as high as that in the 2000s. But what about the mortgages? We should talk about that.
Absolutely, because the mortgage rates certainly correspond to those. But what I found really, really interesting about the mortgage rates is that we always just assume, or I certainly always assumed, that the mortgage rates were going to always have the same kind of a buffer built into them as per the cash rate. So if the cash rate was 5%, then we'd expect a 2% buffer, and then the banks would be, making that 2% and it would be 7%. But it didn't actually work like that. And it was interesting to see that if we have a look at the 80s, where we peaked out at 17.5%, my research shows that the mortgage rates were 12 to 17% during that time. And I know mine was 18.5, but there was a very, very small margin for the banks in there. So the margin was probably under 0.5% during the 80s. Skip ahead to the 90s, where we had 17% peak coming in down to 5%. We had average mortgages at 7 to 15. So obviously coming in, we were still sitting at above the 17, we still only had around about a 2% margin built in during that time. 2000s, while our cash rate was 4 to 7.25, we had average mortgage rates of 5% at one stage with only a 1% margin, but then 9.5, giving a 2.25% margin. So during the 2000s, the banks started to become much more profit-centred and started to look at returning better returns to their shareholders. And it's around about that same time that we started to see bank shares become more valuable as well, clearly because they were getting bigger margins on those mortgages. 2010s were at 4.75 to 0.75 in the cash rate. And the margin at the beginning of 2010 was only very low again at 4.5 was the mortgages. So we didn't have very much margin at all there, but then they peaked up towards 7. So there we're looking at that 2.25% margin again. And then of course the 2020s, where we came into the decade with COVID at 0.10% up to 4.35. We're looking again at that roughly 2.25% margin. So the margins ever since the banks became those profit centres and started to want to return more money to their shareholders have been sitting at more to the 2.5% rates.
Yeah, so a lot of people out there will be saying, please, Margaret, don't take me back to the 80s because it was a memory I tried to get rid of. It was so difficult. But let's sort of weigh that up from the 80s to where we are now. What do you think? How does it all sort of come out in the wash?
It's also a great comparison to make. And I remember having my first mortgage during the very early 80s when interest rates did start to go up toward that very high rate. And of course, I've had a mortgage ever since the early 80s. So I've been through every single one of these ups and downs. And I can remember, life was tough then, but I don't recall having the huge amount of stress that people have today. And this is why. So back in the 1980s and at around about the 1989 peak, when we got up to those 18.5% mortgage rates, the median house price in Sydney then was around 4 times the average household income. And nationally, that was the median house price in Sydney. Nationally, it was 3 times the average household income. So combined income, which we didn't necessarily have a lot of 2-income families back then, but entire household income. Now, mortgage repayments at that time meant that a standard loan ate up around about 45 to 55% of disposable household income, which felt like a lot. But I think the difference was the cost of living probably wasn't quite as bad as it is now. The average full-time earnings in 1989 was $27,000 a year, a lot more than I can remember earning at that time. Inflation was running hot at the time. I think what was happening then is that we had a lot of rate rises, but housing was definitely a lot cheaper relative to wages than it was today. Interesting, back then, the barrier to entry wasn't so much that you couldn't get the deposit or afford to buy the house. The barrier was serviceability. So banks wouldn't lend to you because with repayments at 17 to 18%, you needed to be in those higher income brackets to be able to get into the market at all. So serviceability was the problem back then. So if we come to today and post those 2022 hikes that we've got, Sydney median house price is now 13 to 14 times the average household income. Nationally, it's only sitting at about 7 to 8, but that's still double, almost triple what it was for us in the 80s. And deposits now take 10 years to save for many households, whereas they used to take 2 to 3 years to save the deposit that you needed. Average mortgages at the moment are 6 to 6.5%. So it might be lower than the 80s, but the loans are a lot bigger. And then that means that the repayments have gone back to eating into 40 to 50% of income, but the rest of your income is spent on a much higher cost of living now as well. Average full-time earnings today is $98,000 a year. If you add inflation, rent, and then we've got things like childcare that weren't really costs for us when we were first having children. Even with those lower loan rates at the moment, just the sheer size of loans is making housing affordability extremely difficult. And the barrier is that deposit, not so much the serviceability.
Well, it's a great breakdown that you have done. I have been saying it for the last few years that in this current cycle for anybody trying to buy their first property, compared to baby boomers, it is just not a fair comparison, and you're sort of highlighting exactly that. Margaret, travel well on the boat. Happy birthday for tomorrow as well, and thanks for coming on to the Real Estate Breakfast.
No problem, and I'll see you in about 6 weeks.
Eager to expand your property expertise? Enhance your real estate know-how with us. We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.